Biphobes in the comments will be removed and reported. I'm not putting up with your nonsense. Happy Pride Month, everyone. It's once again that magical time of year where we celebrate that we're still here, we're still queer, we're not going anywhere anytime soon, and companies are still throwing on a coat of rainbow paint in an attempt to convince us that they've been on our side the whole time and that we should be giving them our money for determining our existence to be profitable. Okay, so we don't really celebrate that last part, but the point still stands. And what's another important part of Pride Month that we absolutely cannot do without? That's right, YouTube video essays on LGBT topics. A tradition I'm very happy to help maintain in my own small way. All joking aside, I've really been looking forward to this essay, as it's been running through my mind on a near daily basis over the last few months. Bisexual representation, and if we're being honest, LGBT representation in general, is something I care a lot about, and I wanted to be sure that I could make this the best I could. As with my Ace Rep video though, I do need to add the disclaimer that while I am fairly knowledgeable on the topic, I myself am not bisexual, and therefore cannot speak for anyone who actually exists under the bisexual umbrella, and you should absolutely prioritize the words and experiences of actual bisexual people. My goal, as always, is to spread information and appreciation, not to speak over anyone's lived experiences. This is just a topic I'm very passionate about, because I have some really cool bisexual and pansexual friends, and bi and pan people are just awesome in general. So with that in mind, let's move right into the video proper, shall we? Let's talk about bisexual representation. Also, all the music and game footage will be in the credits at the end of the video like always. Oh, and please like this video and support me on Patreon if you can spare the money, please and thank you! Part 1. The bi basics and unpacking biphobia. So normally I like to start these videos with some definitions, usually by defining the topic of the video, and while I'd still like to do that, it is slightly more complicated than usual today, so I'd like to ask people to wait until the end of this section before you try to correct me in the comments, okay? So what does it mean to be bisexual? Well, at the most basic, dictionary definition level of explanation, bisexual means that someone is attracted to both men and women, or to more than one sex or gender. However, the term bisexual functions both as a sexual identity and a greater umbrella term that encompasses multiple other sexualities, such as pansexual, polysexual, and omnisexual. And I should note that for that reason, I will be using the term bisexual as a general shorthand for the rest of the video, and specifying any people or characters' specific sexuality when I talk about them just for simplicity's sake. The thing about these different sexualities is that, while pansexual, polysexual, and omnisexual people fall under the bisexual umbrella, they generally do not identify as bisexual themselves, and it's considered, at best, very rude to refer to them as just bisexual, or to treat the terms as if they are interchangeable. And if my fellow monosexuals, which is the term for people who are attracted to only one sex or gender, find this a baby bit confusing, don't worry, I am right there with you. See, in preparing to talk about the topic of bisexual versus pansexual, I did my own research, talked to my bi and pan friends, and watched other YouTubers converse on the subject, and the conclusion I came to is that nobody can agree on exactly where the line is drawn. Some people who identify as pan or poly or omni feel that bisexual is too limited a term that doesn't cover their identity well enough because, by its definition, it doesn't cover trans and non-binary individuals, while some bisexuals feel angry that people are essentially accusing a sexual identity that has always implicitly included attraction to trans and non-binary people as being transphobic. And speaking as one of those trans non-binary people, it feels to me like, outside of wanting a term for their identity that feels like it more fully encapsulates who they are, this is kind of an issue of prescriptivist versus descriptivist readings of the term bisexual. Bisexuality has always included attraction to trans and non-binary people, because while the bi in the word literally means two, it has not been colloquially used that literally for a very long time, because most people understand the implications of what it means. However, that does not mean I do not understand the need for a term that feels like it more truly aligns with who you are. As I've discussed before, I am non-binary, but more specifically I am agender, and being able to have a firm grasp on my identity feels good. It makes it all feel more real, for lack of a better word. And to a lot of people, the distinctions between bi, pan, poly, and omni may seem arbitrary and small at best, but that doesn't actually matter because it isn't your identity, and they're very important distinctions to the people who do have them as their identity. So if someone tells you what their sexuality is, you refer to them by that. It doesn't matter if you don't understand it or you think you know better, because you are not the arbiter of anyone else's identity. I don't care who you are or what you identify as, just like with pronouns, you will respect other people's sexual identities or we're gonna have a fucking problem. Whether a person is bi, pan, or anything else found under the Mogai list of sexualities and gender identities, you will call them what they say they are, because it's polite, because it's the right thing to do, because you're an asshole if you don't, and because I will personally smack you in the face with a gravedigger's spade if I catch you being mean to them. Remember, it costs you nothing to be kind, but being a bigot might just cost you your teeth. On the subject of bigotry and assholes though, I would like to take a moment to talk about biphobia, because it has been and remains a problem, and I'd like to address my fellow monosexual people because it really needs to fucking stop. So here's the thing about bisexual people. They are not inherently less trustworthy than gay or straight people are. Despite jokes of indecision that admittedly bisexuals seem pretty fond of themselves, they do not need to choose between a man or a woman, nor are they inherently more promiscuous because of their sexuality. Obvious statements, I know, but apparently some people don't understand these things, so here I am explaining it. There's a problem I notice that keeps popping up when biphobia is discussed, wherein people tend to boil it down to whether or not you would date a bisexual person, and people seem to interpret this like it's just a normal conversation on preferences, and while I will definitely be discussing this at length, I feel it's important to note that biphobia is more than just being willing to date bisexuals, because that detail is just a side effect of the greater stigma and attitudes that are directed at bisexual people, which form the backbone of biphobia as a whole. I touched on some of them just moments ago. There's the idea that bisexuality isn't scientifically possible, the stigma that bisexuals just want attention, or are simply confused or slutty or just unwilling to choose for some reason, and that they're untrustworthy cheats who want to fuck everyone without exception and have no self-control. And none of that is true of the group. On the individual level, some might be, but just as literally any other group, that does not translate to being true of the whole. A lot of biphobia essentially boils down to an attitude of monosexism, or the idea that it's really only possible to be attracted to one sex or gender, and people who think they're attracted to more than one are either just gay, straight, or lying. And a lot of assholes really like to treat bisexuals as if they're just lying. And one of the things they'll do to justify this is to point to bi people with a preference and claim they're actually just one or the other, but that's complete bullshit. While it's true that bi, pan, poly, and omni people are capable of being attracted to multiple genders, it's also true that most tend to have a preference that leans towards masc or femme-presenting people. And there are a variety of reasons that any individual might lean towards one or the other, but the truth is that the why of it doesn't actually matter. They're still attracted to more than one, and you're still an asshole for trying to erase them. And honestly, this attitude largely seems to be where bi-erasure stems from. People seem unwilling to acknowledge that it's possible for bisexuality to exist, or in some extremely baffling cases, argue that it's possible for only women to be bisexual, but that men can't be, which is such an obvious double standard and such bullshit that I think that anyone who parrots it should receive an automatic punch in the throat. I think the reason that discussion so often breaks down to would you date a bisexual though, is because the question serves as a pretty good litmus test for the presence of biphobia. Generally speaking, if someone says they wouldn't, then it stems from these other issues. And people will often claim they're not biphobic, they just couldn't see themselves dating a bisexual. It just couldn't be them. And dear viewer, if you are one of these people who have spouted that paradox, I'd like you to do me a favour. I'd like you to take a moment of self-reflection and ask yourself why you wouldn't ever date a bisexual. Really interrogate that thread of logic while I go over some of the potential sources of biphobia, because whether or not you realize it, that attitude does come from somewhere, and it's important to understand where and why, especially if you're a member of the LGBT community, because there is a massive amount of hypocrisy in that line of thinking that I know might make you uncomfortable to sift through, but that you really do need to analyze. One of the things you have to consider when talking about where biphobia comes from is the concept of stigma, which is essentially a social mark of disgrace associated with certain qualities or circumstances. Things like being poor, being overweight, or being queer are all traits that have certain negative stigma attached to them. And the stigma attached to each one of these comes from a certain place, usually from multiple different factors, and bisexuality is no different in that regard. However, while there are general stigmas attached to all bi people, there also seem to be stigma specific to the gender of the bi person in question, which can make things complicated. So I'll cover those first, and then I'll get to the more general stigmas. There's also stigma that comes from racial sources, but that's not something I'd feel comfortable covering on my own, so I'd like to recommend Khadija Mbawe's video on unpacking the down low phenomenon, which I'll link to down below. They cover prejudice against bisexual men from a specifically black POV, so it's well worth your time. In a more general sense though, a lot of stigma against bisexual men seems to come from the AIDS epidemic. If you didn't know, the big reason the AIDS epidemic became an epidemic in the first place is because the public largely understood it as just being a gay disease, and while the government knew better, they also didn't see it as a problem because it was killing off what they considered to be the right kind of people. The expendable, unwanted members of the population they felt society would be better without. And because the disease was considered just a gay thing, it was mistakenly believed that straight people couldn't get it. And we all know how true that turned out to be. But it was during the height of the AIDS epidemic that the New York Times printed an article known as The AIDS Spectre for Women, the Bisexual Man, which went full lavender scare, oh look it up, and warned straight women that their bisexual boyfriends were a danger to them. The article was full of scaremongering tactics that painted bisexual men as inherently dangerous and untrustworthy, and as the single biggest factor to the transmission of AIDS from the gays to the straights. It should be noted, by the way, that the actual biggest transmission factor was unprotected sex and sharing needles, neither of which the article presented as potential dangers to watch out for. And it did this because the goal wasn't safety, it was scapegoating. It didn't posit AIDS as the real threat, it posited bisexual men as the actual danger. And this fearmongering worked. This attitude is why, for the longest time, gay and bisexual men were forbidden from donating blood. And this attitude towards bisexuals as untrustworthy, secretive and devious has similarly stuck around. People often do not realise just how much the fearmongering and propaganda of the past still affects people's attitudes in the future. Because while the reality is that bisexual men are as inherently trustworthy as any monosexual man, the attitude that they're not is still around and largely goes unexamined by people who really should know better. As far as bi women go, well, it appears to at least partially stem from political lesbianism, which was a movement born during second wave feminism that followed the philosophy that, and I am simplifying this just a bit, women had a moral duty to stop having sex with men and choose to become lesbians, as they would otherwise be literally sleeping with the enemy, and therefore betraying women everywhere. Believers in political lesbianism tied their lesbian identity to their feminism, with feminism being the theory and lesbianism being the praxis. Now, I object to political lesbianism for a number of reasons, but the reason most relevant to this video is the way it treats bisexual women. See, political lesbianism hit an obvious snag when it came to straight women because, while they may be willing to withhold sex with men, they also weren't attracted to other women, and most had no interest in engaging in sapphic activities. But bisexual women are attracted to women as well as men, and so political lesbianism became the ultimate test of a bi woman's commitment to her feminism. And it's honestly one of the more insidious catch-22s I've come across. The attitude essentially boils down to a bi woman needing to fully abstain from men and fully commit to only sleeping with women, otherwise they were bad feminists. But if they could fully commit to only sapphic practices, well then obviously they weren't bisexual in the first place. So you were either a bad feminist who didn't care about women, or your identity wasn't validated and you were miserable because of that. Which is fucking disgusting, and I could go on, but I think I've made my point. If you're interested in the general history of biphobia and just bisexuality in general, YouTuber Verily Bitchy is an actual bisexual and has a lot of videos covering the subject that I found very helpful, so I'll link to their channel below if you're interested in conversations on more specific topics. Before we move on to the next video segment, there are two more general sources of biphobia I'd like to discuss. The second is the topic of trust, and the first is the return of our old friend, amatonormativity, which really rarely gets talked about at all, and as far as I know, pretty much never in relation to the subject of bisexuality. For those who don't know, amatonormativity is the general social attitude that romantic and sexual relationships are inherently more important than any other relationship you form. I talked about it in my Ace Rep video, so if you want a more detailed analysis on it, then please feel free to check it out there. The thing about amatonormativity, though, is I do believe it has an impact on the way people view bisexuality. See, one of the aspects of amatonormativity is the inflation of the importance of finding the one. That single person who exists to be your perfect match in every way. And bisexuals kind of fly in the face of that because, well, if they're attracted to multiple genders, then that kind of implies that a member of any gender could be their the one, and it could even call into question the idea of having a the one at all. I'll be honest, I've never believed in any of that. I think love is something that you have to work on and build, and I've always thought that the romanticization of love is the source of a lot of absolutely horrible attitudes, and I think this is probably why I've noticed that bisexuality seems to make people who do believe in it uncomfortable and insecure, since if there's the potential for someone to have more than one perfect partner, then the idea that you yourself might not be that for the person you're in love with could really get to you. And I think this actually leads into the issue of trust I mentioned earlier, because a lot of the reasons that I've seen people say they wouldn't date a bisexual person, the reasons that aren't just straight up homophobia I mean, essentially boil down to, I'm afraid they'll leave me for someone of the gender opposite mine, or I can't trust them around men or women because they're attracted to both. And here's the thing, I do understand that first sentiment a bit. I completely understand being insecure. Whenever I'm in a relationship with someone, I need the occasional reassurances that I'm not driving them away and that my very existence isn't a burden that they're only barely tolerating out of pity. Because I'm gay and autistic and I had my self-worth systematically assassinated by the American public school system. But here's the thing about that. That's a me problem. That's something I've had to work through with a therapist, and aside from the aforementioned need for reassurances, I would never dream of putting that on my partners because that's not fucking fair. And outside of my trauma and depression telling me that nobody could possibly just like me for me, I always implicitly trust my partners. My last boyfriend was bisexual and we even had a semi-open relationship, and I trusted him because I loved him and he gave me literally no reason not to. And trust really does seem to be the operative word here, because as I mentioned, some people say that they couldn't date a bi person because they wouldn't be able to trust them, and I call bullshit. I'm gonna drop a hard truth on you. If you've ever used this excuse, you shouldn't be in a relationship at all, you should be in therapy. Because your biggest problem isn't your biphobia, though that is a big fucking problem. It's that you have deep-seated trust issues that will fucking poison any romantic relationship you have. If you wouldn't trust a bi person, you also wouldn't trust a monosexual person. You're just using one issue to justify the other. This is a thing people seriously need to understand. It does not matter if a bisexual person finds someone of a gender different to yours attractive. Nor does it matter that they could leave you for this hypothetical other person, because anyone you date could leave you for someone else. What matters isn't that they find other people attractive, it's that they are actively choosing to be with you, and your refusal to extend any level of trust based on that choice demonstrates personal problems you should probably talk to a professional about. The reason I wouldn't date a bisexual makes you a biphobic asshole is because you are judging someone based on their sexuality, which is the very definition of bigotry. It's not a matter of taste or attraction, because bisexual isn't a body type or an indicator of incompatible morality or personality. You are just making a judgment on someone based upon an inborn trait they have no control over, which makes you an asshole. And this is why I said LGBT people should fucking know better, because all of us know what it's like to be judged based on our gender identity or sexuality, and all of us know it's wrong to do so. And that brings us to the final reason someone might be biphobic, because they really want an other to beat up on. And whether it's because they want someone to feel superior to, or because they mistakenly think that by making another group their shared enemy, the straights will be nicer to them, which is something some complete dipshits really think will happen, believe it or not, they are in the wrong. And no, person in the comments deliberately missing the point, nobody is saying you have to go out with a bi person, or you're an asshole. Nobody is saying that you have to date any individual you're not attracted to. But if you would go out with someone and then decide you're not going to because you find out they're bisexual, then I'm afraid you're doing a bigotry, Stephanie. Get over yourself and grow as a person. We all have biases and prejudices we need to check, and we could all stand to grow as people through self-reflection and a willingness to improve. Yes, even me. Anyway, that's enough on this subject for now. Let's move on to discussing representation. Part 2. Rules to write by. As usual, I will be going over what I believe to be important guidelines in writing proper representation. If you have any you personally believe are important that I don't bring up, please feel free to share them in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Rule 1. Be respectful of the character's identity. As I've said before, this is a good rule to follow when it comes to depicting any marginalized group, LGBT or not. But we are focusing on bisexuality today. And to start, do not depict bisexuals as inherently more promiscuous than monosexuals. This is something that used to be a lot more common, where all bisexual characters, usually women for reasons, were the slutty McSluttersons slutting it up with everyone around them. Think Catherine Zeta-Jones' character from that god-awful The Haunting movie from 1999, or the character of Maureen from the movie adaptation of Rent, who breaks up with one guy to date a girl and won't stop hitting on other people even during her wedding. And yes, she is meant to be bisexual here, the creators just clearly had opinions on bi women. And this isn't to say that you can't depict a bi character as promiscuous, but when you have them just so much hornier and flirtier than the entire rest of the cast, and the one big thing that separates them is that they're bi, you're sending the message that this is what you think bisexuals are like. Another important part of this rule, and I shouldn't have to say this, but it's something that people don't always get, is that if you're writing a bisexual villain, fucking do not depict their sexuality as a symptom of their villainy. The trope of the depraved bisexual is old as dirt, and Partially based in the days of the Hays Code, where the pearl-clutching moral guardians of the entertainment industry forbid any displays of queer people in a positive light, as they saw us as inherently corruptive and degenerate, and so movie depictions of us had to show us as villains who died for our crimes against proper living, lest the innocent masses think it's okay to not be straight. But it also stems from the idea that a villain is just scarier if you're not sure if they're messing with you for nefarious reasons or sexually nefarious reasons. And since you never know where you stand with a bisexual, that's even scarier. Excuse me while I go throw up. I've said this before and I'll say it again. You can have LGBT characters as villains, but the moment you depict our LGBT status as the reason or a symptom of our villainy, you have fucked up. As always, you need to think critically about how the way you depict a group will come across to people. Rule 2. Acknowledge the character's identity in text. This is one of those points that should be obvious, and yet it's always the one people struggle with the most. Simply put, if you do not acknowledge the character's sexuality or gender identity in some way within the text of the show, game, movie, or whatever, then it does not count. The creator tweeting that a character is gay or trans, or going on a podcast and saying that they're ace, does not count as representation. And there are a few reasons for this. First of all, it's because people do not engage with the characters in tweets and podcasts. They engage with them in the medium they are put in. So if a character is not demonstrated or stated to be LGBT in the source material, then most audience members will not know that they are, and that defeats the purpose of having representation in the first place. And the second reason is that it is fucking lazy. Some creators really want the sweet, sweet praise for being a good ally, but don't want to put in the actual work of writing a character, or risk having conservatives find out they acknowledge gay people exist and get pissy about it. So making it canon on Twitter is a nice safe alternative that also saves them the effort of putting in any work. But Twitter canon isn't actual fucking canon, and you are a lazy coward if that's the only way you're willing to give people LGBT content. And I'm sure you can think of a few creators who have done this, like J.K. Rowling with Dumbledore, or N.D. Stevens with 80% of She-Ra's supposed LGBT characters. Also, if you have to confirm the character's LGBT status online because most people didn't get it, then you failed in your job as a writer. My favorite example of this is probably the whole Kurosami thing, where the show literally ended on them getting together, but it was so ambiguous as to what it even was that Break had to go on record to state that the girls were together and bisexual. And there's been a lot of myth-making surrounding Kurosami, largely that it was planned from the start and that the hints were there from the beginning. But speaking as someone who recently rewatched the entire series and made 4 separate videos on it, I can say with absolute certainty that it was not. Not only is there zero lead up to it before maybe the last half of season 4, but Break have actually admitted in an interview that Korra and Asami getting together was a literal last-minute decision. So any hints or foreshadowing that people point to are just a mix of cope and confirmation bias. Bright basically just yelled bisexual avatar and then slammed the door, which isn't great representation, especially considering they needed to clarify it for the vast majority of people, both gay and straight alike. Credit where it's due though, at least they were honest about it. And here's the thing, you do not actually need to have the character say the word bisexual for it to count, though it would be really better if more people did, as there are plenty of ways to show it otherwise. You can have them mention past lovers of both genders, say that they like both, have them flirt with both. There are a bunch of ways to do it. There is a caveat to this though, and that is that if you want to depict a character as being a specific variant, like pansexual, then you're going to need to actually have them say it if you want them to be proper representation for that group. As a lot of people only really seem to know of bisexuality, and just giving the character a pan flag pin or something isn't really going to cut it. Again, there are ways to do it without just saying the word, but that is the best way to do it. Remember, it's important that representation be both visible and understandable, and it's for this reason that I'm mostly going to avoid listing characters whose bi moments are played off as jokes. There's also a discussion to be had about player sexuality, but I'll get to that in the video games section. Rest assured, I will be talking about it. Rule 3. If you have both human and non-human characters, do not exclude all representation of a group to the non-human characters. I bring this rule up every time I make one of these videos because I think it's a good one, but I feel like this is something that generally happens to non-binary and asexual characters more than any other. And the reason for this rule is pretty simple. If you confine certain sexualities and gender identities to non-human characters, it implies that having those traits is inherently inhuman, which is bad. This is actually pretty easy to work around though, as if you do have a mixed species cast, then making characters of both species LGBT is the way to go, and the shows and games with the best representation tend to go this route. Rule 4. Make characters of multiple different genders bisexual, not just women in the femme presenting. So something I've taken note of for a very long time, and this is something that has always bothered me, is that the vast majority of bisexual representation in media comes in the form of either women or femme-presenting characters. And while you could make the argument that this is true to life because there are more bisexual women than men, but this is a false assertion because there aren't actually more bisexual women than men. Women just tend to feel more comfortable coming out as bi because the social ramifications of being called gay tend to be less severe for women than they do for men. And I would argue that men being less comfortable coming out as bi is actually a really big reason why there should be more explicit male bisexual characters in media. But that's a different conversation for a different time. No, the primary reason you tend to see more femme-presenting bisexual characters in media is the male gaze, which is a topic I recently discussed in this video here, so you can watch that if you're curious on that subject. Under the male gaze, any sapphic actions are interpreted as being performative, as being done for the sake of the male audience's titillation, because a lot of straight men find girl-on-girl action to be obscenely hot. Which is also why, for the longest time, you saw far more lesbians than gay men in media, because they were seen as more acceptable to the male audience, so creators could claim they cared about representation and also not worry about potentially offending the fragile masculinity of these straight men in the audience. And as I said in the male gaze video, I am in no way trying to imply that lesbians and bi women have it any easier than gay or bi men, just that they're seen as safer. I'll touch on this more when I get to specific examples later, but the fact of the matter is that we really do need to see a wider array of bisexual characters, male, female, and non-binary, because that is far more true to life than any other option. Rule 5. Don't bury your gaze, shitheads. And before any dipshits try to actually me, look up bury your gaze before you type the comment that'll make you look the fool. Alright, I think that's all of them. As I said, I think these create a pretty good baseline to build on, but I'd still love to hear your own rules or guidelines you think make for good representation. And with all that established, let's hop into some examples of bisexual characters in popular media, starting with Part 3. Live action. Before I continue, I would like to establish that I'm not going to be including characters whose sexuality is merely an informed attribute, which is when a character is said to be something or have something, but it's never really shown on screen. This is essentially just an in-text equivalent to Word of God, and I don't consider it to be good representation, so I'm sure you can understand why I made this decision. Okay? Okay. This section is also going to be the shortest because, well, I haven't been watching a lot of live action things lately, and trying to find solid information on a lot of characters that I haven't personally watched is like closing my eyes, throwing a rock into a lake, and trying to land it in a boat. Since a lot of wikis just do not fill out their character pages, which is a personal pet peeve, let me tell you something. And for no particular reason, we'll start with Brittany Pierce from Glee, who I believe is the only bisexual main cast member in the show, though she doesn't really care to put a label on it or treat it like a big deal. The show actually starts out with people believing that both Brittany and Santana are somewhere on the bi spectrum, but Santana later comes out as a lesbian and declares her love for her blonde cohort. Brittany is honestly kind of a mixed bag, because she's largely treated as a hyper-promiscuous hornball for most of the show, who's apparently too dumb to realise that sleeping with Santana when she's dating someone else is still cheating. But she does have a really good moment where, when Santana confesses and Brittany's dating Artie, she refuses to break up with him, going so far as to rebuke Santana for calling him just a stupid boy, because she really does like him and cares about his feelings. I mean, she and Artie do break up later, but that's caused by his own insecurities, making him act stupid and fumble her like a scrub. She might not be the best representation, but she's still not too bad overall. One of these days I should really do a video on Glee's LGBT rep as a whole, because some of it was actually pretty good. Not a lot, mind you, but enough to be worth talking about. But while Jack's flirty habits are sometimes played as a joke, his sexuality isn't. We adored him. They should really bring him back again. Then there's Angela Montenegro from the show Bones, a brilliant artist, critically important member of the team, and probably the single best character in the show in my humble opinion. While we largely see her dating guys, it's stated fairly early in the series that she had her heart broken by a girl named Roxy in art school, and she actually meets Roxy again on a case when she's a suspect, and they start dating again after the real murderer is caught. They break up after a while, but crucially, it's not because of her sexuality, as she's bisexual and Roxy is a lesbian, but because their outlooks on life are incompatible. Angela also gets to flirt with a few other girls in the show before she marries Hodgins, and they're a really cute couple. What I like about Angela is that she's never treated as a joke, nor is her bisexuality really made into a big deal. Not a super big deal at least, the boys still have their les-yay moments. She also very much ends up being one of the most human characters in the cast, as she's incredibly empathetic and caring, which makes sense. Her job is to give murder victims back their face, to salvage their identities and make sure they're not forgotten. The last really good character I want to talk about is Rosa Diaz from Brooklyn 99, who comes out as bisexual in season 5 of the show in probably the most Rosa way possible.
Something I'd like to say. I'm a pretty private person, so this is kind of hard for me, but here we go. I'm bisexual. All right, I will now field 1 minute and 0 seconds of questions pertaining to this. Go.
God, the show is good. But while the 99 is supportive, her parents are less than enthusiastic, we'll say.
We want you to know we're not upset.
Great. I'm not upset either.
Because no matter what you call yourself, you still like men, so you can still get married and have a child.
I can do those things with either a man or a woman.
Yes, but it will be a man, because this is just a phase.
It hurts her to have her parents react like this, to have them try to erase her identity like this. And no, this isn't the most original storyline, but it's good, and I honestly like how the show handles it. Rosa is often portrayed as completely untouchable and invincible, but she still cares what other people think, and her family's acceptance is important to her. It's something she desperately wants and sadly does not get at first. But she still has the 99, she still has people who love and accept her for who she really is. And that's what truly matters. And honestly, I think what Captain Holt says is an incredibly important lesson to take away from all this.
Every time someone steps up and says who they are, the world becomes a better, more interesting place. So, thank you.
Also, I know I said Rosa was the last, but can we just take a minute to appreciate that Dr. Robotnik in the Sonic movies is pansexual? In the third movie, he laments that his attitude has rendered him repulsive to people of all genders, which is about as open a declaration of pansexuality as you can get without actually saying the word. It could probably be argued that making just the villain pansexual is bad representation, but I personally think doing it with, let's be honest, the single most popular character in these movies was a good choice. Okay, we're moving on. Part 4. Animation. So, do you remember how I mentioned that a lot of creators will just half-imply bisexuality and then confirm it on Twitter or in an interview? Well, animation is where that tends to happen the most, and it also tends to be the place where bisexuality is the most commonly made into a joke. I'll have something more to say on that later, but for now I'm going to focus largely on examples that eschew those two occurrences. And this may surprise you, but I'm actually going to be starting with an anime example. Specifically, Haruhi's father from Ouran High School Host Club. You know, one of the best anime ever. While it may seem like Ronka is meant to be a joke character at first, what with the cross-dressing and all, he's actually a deeply devoted father and openly bisexual, as he still very much loves his late wife, but also takes home male lovers as part of his job, which isn't actually framed in a negative light, and he's never made out to be a bad or messed up person for it, which is really rare for older anime, especially when the character is an adult man. Considering how many anime depict both bisexuals and drag queens as being perverts, rapists, pedophiles, freaks, or a combination of them all, Ronka is a genuinely refreshing take on such a character. Hopping back over west for a moment, Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, who I normally wouldn't count so much since they don't really get into a relationship with each other or even spell out their feelings until nearly the end of the series, and until then their relationship is pretty much just ship teasing. But the show also got that short additional piece on them just being a couple together, and I'm a sucker for loving queer domesticity, so I'm including it. Though I will dock points for Marceline's sexuality only being confirmed via Twitter canon. Do better. There's also Princess Bean from Disenchantment, who shows attraction to both men and women throughout the show, and eventually ends up dating Mora the mermaid. It's very cute. Also, her voice actress is bi herself. And don't worry, I wouldn't dream of talking about bi rep without mentioning Blake and Yang from RWBY, both of whom have shown attraction to men in the past and eventually fall in love with each other. And while they're cute together, the execution of their romance was honestly kind of shit, as there was no actual build up to it. They just eventually kill Blake's ex in season 6, and then they're suddenly together and displaying couple behavior with no explanation. And they don't even officially talk about their feelings until volume 9, because the show was written by hacks addicted to ship teasing. Miles and Carrie's overinflated egos and refusal to take a writing class really ended up fucking with the show's attempts at representation. I've been told Ice Queendom is doing the build up to their romance better, and the show has different writers, so hopefully that ends up being true, because Blake and Yang deserve more time being a couple. Looking back to proper anime for a moment, Akihiko and Haruki from the second season of Given are both bisexual men, who end up falling in love with each other, and Yuri Katsuki from Yuri on Ice is also bisexual. which I think tends to get lost in the whole thing surrounding Victor, but he does state that he had a crush on his friend Yuko in episode 1. Also, Carolyn Tuesday has 2 different bi characters. Erdogan, who states that he only loves capable guys and great chicks, his words not mine, and Marie, who used to date Gus, but is revealed to be engaged to a woman named Anne by the time the show starts. Oh yes, and Chicken Nugget is pansexual, as revealed in the TikTok, Chicken is Pan. Also Randy Feltface, who says it himself. I had no idea which category to actually put him in, so he's just going right here. And of course, I can't talk about the best bisexual characters without mentioning Luz Noceda from The Owl House, Norma Khan from Dead End Paranormal Park, and Sam and Luna from The Loud House. Now you all know Luz, you all love Luz, and if you don't love her, you don't have a heart. Luz's sexuality is actually hinted at pretty early on as she talks about falling in love with an upperclassman, blushes at both Edgic and Amira, and eventually starts dating Amity, and the whole thing is so fucking cute and they're great and I love her, okay? You've also probably heard of Sam and Luna, at least in passing. They had an entire episode dedicated to going out on their first date and being absolutely adorable, and they're great. Everything about them is done really well. You might not have heard about Norma though, which is a shame because I know I told people to watch Dead End Paranormal Park, and I'd be very disappointed if they didn't listen. I'm going to avoid spoiling too much because you should really go watch the show, but Norma is an autistic Pakistani American who shares the main character spotlight with her trans best friend Barney as they deal with demons and ghosts, and yeah, go watch the fucking show, please! Norma actually comes out as bisexual in the 2nd season to the heartwarming support of her friends and mom, and she has a crush on her Iranian friend Badia, and the whole thing is done really well. That's all you get from me though. Now remember to do the thing. Please and thank you. Oh yes, and before we move on to the next section, we also need to take a moment to talk about the works of Vivian Medrano, aka Vivzipop. So Medrano's work contains a lot of queer characters. It probably has one of the highest ratios of non-straight to straight out of any show currently being made, which is great. Some of the characters openly state what they are, like Moxie being bisexual, and others demonstrate it through their actions. And this is fine, like I said, not everyone needs to openly say what they are. The problem is though, that Vivzy really likes announcing these things on Twitter. She actually made a Pride post last year that revealed a lot of the characters in their flags, which was neat, but also lazy from a writing standpoint. Someone actually asked me about this a while ago in the comments of another video. I think it was my Ace Rep video actually. And while I know this is going to piss off some people and bring other people who've been stroking their Vivzipop hate boners ever since I made my last Helliverse video to Swift Orgasm, but I was not a fan of this. And I'll try to keep this brief, but if you don't want to hear it, feel free to skip to the next section. Look, I like Vivzipop's work, and I appreciate the amount of LGBT rep she puts into her shows, but I would be a massive hypocrite if I did not criticize her for her mass Twitter canonization of the characters' queer identities. Word of God is not proper representation, and while we could assume that characters like Blitz, Chad, and Asmodeus fell under the bi umbrella just based on everything about them ever, pansexuals already barely get any recognition at all, and it really wouldn't have been hard to bring it up in some capacity in the show, even if it's just a fucking pan flag somewhere. Give them something to let them feel seen in the fucking show itself. Moxie straight up says he's bi, so it's not like the words for individual sexualities don't exist in hell. And this is to say nothing of the Ace characters. Arrow Ace people already have to settle for scraps more than anyone else, and until now the best they've had in the Helliverse was Alistor, and I already went over him in my Ace Rep video. And maybe she does plan to explore Octavia or Mammon's asexuality at some point, but that should really come before posting it to Twitter. It should always come before posting it to fucking Twitter. Look, just show your work. Put the characters' identities in text, and do the work of proper representation, or don't be shocked when people like me, who actually care, get mad at you for doing less than the bare minimum and expecting praise. And to be clear, I do not think Viv is a bad person for this, nor do I think this was done out of malice. I just think she needs to more carefully consider how she goes about doing these things, and put in the proper work to show the representation on screen. Okay, we're moving on. Part 5. Video games. The conversation around bisexual representation grows a little bit more complicated when it comes to video games, because, as I've said before, video games are unique from other forms of media in that they require interactivity, and that means having to accommodate player choice within the mechanics of the story and in regards to the characters. Does it count as bisexual representation if the player is allowed to romance characters of multiple genders, and if it only exists in the hypothetical situation in which the player decides to go down that path? And what about characters that are attracted to the player regardless of their gender? Where do they fall? Well, I'm going to take a short break from examples of representation to hopefully answer these questions in part something, mechanical bisexuality and the player sexual conundrum. So it seems to me that the debate around player sexuality in video games has grown a lot louder as of late. People argue over what it is, what qualifies, if it's good or bad, and so on and so forth. And since I can't really make a video on bi representation without touching on it, I think now is probably a good time to weigh in on that conversation. For those who don't know, player sexual refers to the state where a game, usually an RPG, has romance options and every romanceable character is available to the player regardless of your gender, species, secondary sexual characteristics, or any other aesthetic factors, and very often regardless of morality or story decisions. It is a case of the developer bending over backwards to avoid telling the player no to a romance option, and once you have created the character, there is no way to make yourself romantically undesirable except to either kill the character in question or to do something so absolutely antithetical to their beliefs that it would be literally impossible for the writers to justify it continuing. Player sexuality has become more common in RPGs, with Baldur's Gate 3 and Dragon Age Veilguard being the biggest and most recent examples, and it's something people are generally mixed on. Some people like it because it means more player choice and lets them spoon whichever hot person they prefer, while others criticize it for its effect of boiling characters down to simple archetypes so that people can more easily slot them into their fantasies. And this often has the effect of making characters weaker and less interesting overall. And people are absolutely aware of this. Player sexual is basically a dirty word at this point. It is a point of criticism leveled at games whenever it shows up. Nobody says player sexual as a compliment or even a neutral descriptor. It is always negative. Except it's a little more complicated than that, because here's the thing about player sexuality, people don't actually hate it as much as they claim. While there absolutely are people who criticize it for the way it treats characters as pin-up dolls, and their characterization as secondary to their status as romance options for the player, and I am counted amongst them for those and my own reasons that I'll get into in just a moment, most people who complain about player sexuality only do so when it's in games they already do not like. And that's because the things I described are what a lot of people actually want in their RPGs. Because this is where we get into another hard truth time, but gamers are a rather entitled bunch. Most players want to be able to romance all their favorite characters without little details like the character's sexuality getting in the way, and there are a lot of gamers who get upset when they're told no. And I say this as an entitled gamer myself, who still hasn't forgiven Intelligent Systems for not making Claude bisexual, even though it was implied in the trailers leading up to the Three Houses release. Player sexuality probably isn't going anywhere because it gives people what they want, which isn't to say it shouldn't be criticized, because this approach to characterization just isn't very good, and it's inherently restrictive to have to make every companion with sex appeal and romance in mind. There are some developers that will reject accusations of player sexuality by claiming the characters are all canonically pan or bi, and I've seen players defend their favorite games with player sexual companions the same way, but that defense doesn't work because it runs up against two issues, those being, 1, that player sexual is a criticism, not a genre label, and you can't just say nuh-uh and expect that to fly. And 2, the characters all being bi or pan isn't a defense against player sexuality, it is a prerequisite to having them be player sexual at all. But this is actually where we come to my personal issues with player sexuality, those being that it's treated as being bi or pan representation when it just isn't, and it's also really fucking lazy. Because games with player sexual companions have a cast that's effectively entirely bi or pan, but none of the characters' relationships to their sexuality is ever explored. And this is something that drives me crazy because characters that actually do explore their sexual identity or have an arc surrounding it are exceedingly interesting, but you just don't get that anymore. Instead, everyone is bi, but nobody has any feelings on being bi because they aren't narratively bisexual, they're mechanically bisexual. Mechanical bisexuality is the term for when games have characters that can be romanced by the player, regardless of the gender of their character, but where the concept of their bisexuality never factors into the writing. So same-sex attraction only exists should the player seek it out. A good example of this is Stardew Valley, where the romanceable characters can be romanced regardless of if you play a man or a woman, but they will change their dialogue to fit your gender. They may comment that they've never felt this way about a girl or a guy, but some of them will outright change the gender of their exes to fit the gender of your character, making them narratively monosexual, but mechanically bisexual. And these same games also tend to not have any bisexual, non-romanceable characters either. Mechanical bisexuality is a problem because it not only tacitly states that bisexual people just do not exist in the world of the game, but it also just does not act as representation because it hides the entirety of its existence behind optional features so as to not upset the straights. And this is bad, this is a bad practice. And really, the only way to fix the problem presented by this is for developers to stop being cowards and make canonically bisexual characters whose sexual identity is affirmed in-game even if the player chooses not to romance them, and to have it consistent in its presentation. In short, just write a bisexual character, you lazy fucking hacks. But on the topic of fixing the problems presented by playersexuality, well, there are a couple of ways to go about it. First of all, you can just learn to say no to players and give the characters different sexualities, which would really be for the best. But if you're scared to do that, then you can always do the actual work of considering the character's sexuality and their relationship to it and integrating it into their story, you know, like a professional writer might, which would at least make them more than just a fucking sex toy for the player. There is, however, something I often find goes untouched when it comes to conversations surrounding player sexuality, and that would be the increasing inclusion of non-binary character building options. Because as usual, we NBs make the conversation just a little bit more complicated. It's weird that I never see non-binary people brought up when the topic of player sexuality comes up, because our existence is almost a defense of it. How do you account for a player whose gender and sometimes even whose body does not line up with the conventional binary of man or woman? How do you avoid alienating players whose gender presentation in-game might be considered comparatively messy or confusing? Player sexuality is the simple answer to all of these questions, but I don't actually like that as the answer, because it still encourages lazy fucking writing disguised as representation. I think the actual answer is that creators should start considering writing bi and pan characters more true to life, by which I mean giving them fucking preferences. Consider what features they'd find attractive, which gender presentation they'd lean more towards, and other details like that. Also give them turn-offs, aesthetic or personality quirks they just find unattractive. Write them like actual people, not just receptacles for player horniness. Sure, it'll piss off the gooners and be more work overall, but you'll end up with much stronger and more realistic characters for it. We used to get more characters whose sexualities were more integral to their personal arcs, and I honestly wonder if we've mostly stopped getting them because gender is the new thing people are obsessing over. We've been getting more stories about exploring trans and non-binary characters, and while I appreciate that and love that I get to see more representation for people like me, I don't want that to be instead of proper representation for everyone else. I want it to be alongside it. I want everyone to be able to feel seen, and I don't see the point in half-assing any of it. Anyway, that's my take on player sexuality for this video. I might come back to this topic in another. Back to the rest of the video proper. Okay, so now that we're talking about characters again, the rules from the former categories apply, but I'm adding the additional rule that I'm not including player characters, player sexual characters, or characters from dating sims unless they explicitly address the topic of the character's sexuality in some way. I actually think that dating sims are kind of the only genre where player sexuality makes sense, because the expectation is that in a dating sim with characters of multiple genders, they should all be available to you regardless of your own gender. I actually think it would make for much better writing if more characters in dating sims were written with an explicitly defined sexuality and a thought out personal relationship to that sexuality, even if that doesn't align with the player character's chosen gender, but I am perfectly okay with being alone in that sentiment, because I don't think many people would actually want that. While I personally would love to see more dating sims where the characters are written to have thoughts and opinions you would ideally care about, you know, like actual people you're trying to date, I also understand that people would fucking hate it if the characters in Boyfriend Dungeon or Date Everything just weren't into you from the get-go. If players were denied the ability to date Jean-Luc Pissoir, there would be riots in the streets, and rightfully so. All that said, I will still only be discussing dating sims that do explore the characters' sexualities in some capacity, because it's my video and I do what I want. And this is actually something that even my beloved Boyfriend Dungeon doesn't do all that well. Of the 10 dateable characters in the game, only Valeria, Jonah and Sawyer mention their sexuality in any capacity at all, and only Valeria ends up being narratively bisexual, as she used to date a guy and his sister at the same time, which worked out for them until a non-relationship issue split them apart, which I actually think is a nice touch. The game is very poly-friendly, and Valeria's previous poly relationship ending without demonizing the concept of being poly at all is cool. Other than her though, Sawyer implies that you're their first everything, from kiss to crush to wielder, and Jonah has only dated men in the past, one being your cousin, so neither is narratively bisexual. Pulse, from Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, flirts with whoever he's healing regardless of gender, and was confirmed to be bisexual by his original writer. Rainbow Six actually has a surprising number of LGBT characters. I was kind of on the fence about including Dream Daddy because I feel it kind of walks the line between actual bi-rep and player sexuality, but Craig, Matt and Robert were all previously married to women, with Craig being divorced and Matt and Robert both being widowers, so I'm going to say it counts. I'd also like to give special mention to Harry Dubois from Disco Elysium, who was in a relationship with a woman named Dora, but then he forgets all about that because head trauma, finds himself attracted to a smoking man on a balcony, and eventually expresses interest in exploring the gay scene. The game doesn't actually give a definitive answer though, and that's because, well, an active murder investigation is not the best time to obsess about his sexuality. So he basically just puts a pin in it till later, which is really fucking funny and so in line with the game as a whole. I fucking love it. Later Alligator is a fucking hilarious game that I cannot recommend enough, and it has two different bisexual characters in the form of Terry the bartender and the Knife. Both characters will flirt with you regardless of your gendered appearance, but the Knife actually goes on a date with you and talks about dating and flirting with both men and women. You should absolutely play this game, it's really good. Another character I find really cool is Parvati Holcomb from The Outer Worlds, who I actually brought up in my Aero Ace Rep video. She's asexual but biromantic, and her writer has even gone on record as saying that she was bringing her own experience as a biromantic asexual woman to the story, which is really cool. Hades became rather well known for the fact that Zagreus was bisexual, able to date either Meg or Thanatos, or even both. And even if you only choose to date the one, Zagreus affirms his feelings for the other as being or having been real, so he has the narrative affirmation down pat. And while it's still in early access, Hades 2 looks to be shaping up the same way, with Malinois having the potential for some form of romantic attachment to Moros, Icarus, Nemesis, and Eris. However, dialogue between Mel and Narcissus of all people seem to imply that she may also fall on the Aero Ace spectrum, which is interesting. At time of writing, Supergiant dropped the Unseen update literally 2 days ago, so I'm currently going through to see what I can find, but so far it seems that Mel is asexual but biromantic as well. Finally, I want to talk about Undertale and Deltarune. So as of the initial release of Undertale, the game had two bisexual/pansexual characters in the form of Alphys, who had an unrequited crush on Asgore and then fell in love with Undyne, and Frisk, who can flirt with anyone regardless of gender. And then there's Asgore. So this is admittedly more theorycraft than anything else, but in additional dialogue that I believe was added in the Switch release of the game, Asgore talks about Rudolph in a way reminiscent of someone ruminating on a lost lover. And in Deltarune, which takes place in an alternate universe, but that we know keeps the characters' sexualities intact because Alphys is still a bisexual mess, Asgore and Rudolph are old friends, and Asgore brings a new bunch of flowers to his hospital room every day, with Rudolph joking that Asgore should just ask him to prom, and actually kind of seeming to like the idea. This has led to people online, myself included, speculating that Asgore and Rudolph either used to date or had feelings for each other, and that those feelings have not gone away. And I actually think that there's a chance the two might get together in the future, once Asgore is able to get his life together and move on from Toriel. Toby Fox has always been pretty LGBT friendly with his games, and it kind of feels like something he might do, considering how the latest chapters have played out and characterized Rudolph, his wife, and both Toriel and Asgore, but this is admittedly all speculation on my part. I will say that Asgore gives pretty strong bi vibes though, and I'd personally love it if he could get a boyfriend and move on from his ex-wife. Yes, I did just waste 2 minutes of your time on my Deltarune fan theory. I'm a menace, I'm not sorry, and we're moving on. Oh my god, I almost forgot Berdly and Rule's card. Okay, so in Deltarune, Berdly is this absolute loser who tries to portray himself as an alpha gamer genius because he thinks it impresses people. And because of this, he's very insistent that both Noelle and Susie must be madly in love with him based off, well, nothing in reality, really. But in Chapter 4 of Deltarune, he calls Noelle up to invite her to the town festival, and Susie tells him to fuck off, and you can then pick up Noelle's phone and ask him yourself. To which he responds by claiming that only the most worthy will be his date, clearly unbothered and quite excited by the prospect of an NB like Chris asking him out. So he counts, and I can't wait to see where that goes. And Rules is revealed to be either bi or pan in the most Rules way possible, by horning in on someone else's relationship and calling them his honeys. It's fucking hilarious, and I will not spoil how it goes because you've gotta see it for yourself. Okay, now we're moving on. As I've worked on this video for the last few weeks, I keep coming back to the question of why? Why do bisexuals keep having to deal with bullshit from both sides, from the straights and the gays? Why do people feel so fucking comfortable deriding and insulting and straight up erasing bi and pan people from the conversation? Bi erasure is such a big issue that even the Freddie Mercury movie, a movie about the life of the single most famous bisexual man in history, had a scene where Freddie says he liked men and women, and he's straight up told, "No Freddie, you're gay." And that's just never corrected. It pissed me off when I saw it in theaters, and it still pisses me off thinking about it now. Because people are just way too fucking comfortable pretending bisexuality doesn't exist until it suits them to acknowledge it. And even then there's almost always a caveat that it's treated like a joke. You have no idea how many characters I didn't include because their sexuality was either treated as a joke or some form of character flaw. You may think I forgot to mention Deadpool in the live action section, but I didn't. Deadpool might be canonically pansexual in both the comics and the movies, but in the comics he only recently was allowed to have anything approaching a romantic relationship with a non-female character, and in the movies his pansexuality is only ever a punchline. His scenes with Vanessa are all explicit and allowed to be emotionally sincere, but every moment with another man is strictly played for comedy. And don't get me wrong, I loved the symbolic car fuck fight scene. But why is that the closest we get to any acknowledgement of his actual attraction to men? Negasonic and Yukio are allowed to be girlfriends, but apparently when it comes to two men then it has to be drenched in plausible deniability and haha just kidding unless energy. Because apparently that's too fucking much for this R-rated movie. He might as well not be pansexual at all with how they play it. People are just way too fucking comfortable in general pretending that pansexuals don't exist, or that polysexuals or omnisexuals or anyone else under the Mogai rainbow are just making shit up for attention. And while I understand where the attitude comes from when we're talking about the straights, nobody in the LGBT community has any excuse whatsoever. Because you know what it's like to be erased or told you're confused or that your existence is wrong just because it's different from what's considered the norm, and some of you fuckers still keep pretending that there's nothing wrong with treating bisexuals as if they're actively harmful. And you should really be doing some fucking soul searching if that's the case. I feel like I need to reiterate this point. There is nothing about being bi or pan that makes someone inherently untrustworthy or dangerous. Just like how being gay doesn't make you a pedophile, or how you're not lesbian because you haven't met the right man, or being trans doesn't make you a predator. And yet people in the queer community are surprisingly fine shitting on bisexuals for having the audacity to be born capable of loving multiple genders, and somehow they don't see the inherent hypocrisy in that, and I don't think that most of them who do that even realize why they feel that way. This is why I encourage people to reflect on their negative attitudes towards bisexuality, because these attitudes do come from somewhere, and people need to start questioning where and why. Because here's another hard truth for you. Just because you're a member of a marginalized group, that does not mean you cannot be a bigot yourself. People are very often blind to their privilege unless someone else points it out, and that blindness increases when they're accustomed to being on the receiving end of bigotry themselves. But everyone is capable of being bigoted, and if you do not learn to recognize when you are, identify where it's coming from and put in the work to address it and improve as a person, then you will stagnate as a person until you're suddenly left wondering why everyone hates you for your bigotry when you consider yourself to be pretty fucking progressive. I've taken to ending my videos on LGBT topics with asking the question of why you should care, and the answer here is the same as any other, because it matters. Because bisexuals and pansexuals and all the others are real people. People whose feelings and identities matter and who deserve to be represented in media with the same level of care that's expected of any other marginalized group. They deserve to be talked about with respect and remembered for who they were, just as much as gay and trans and asexual people do. And more often than not, the fact that people were bisexual is just never taught or cared about by the monosexual majority. I mentioned Freddie Mercury earlier, but did you know that Mary Shelley was bisexual? It's true. After her husband died, she wrote letters about her desires towards other women. Frida Kahlo, Walt Whitman, Joan Crawford, Lou Reed, Virginia Woolf, Malcolm X, all of these people were bisexual. But you'd probably never know half of that if I'd never told you, because that's an aspect that just doesn't get talked about. There's also Lady Gaga, Billie Joe Armstrong, David Mraz, and Margaret Cho, all bisexual, all very much real. And as far as pansexuality goes, you have people like Miley Cyrus, Brendan Urie, Kesha, Youngblood, Bob the Drag Queen, all very real people whose identity means the world to them. Just like any of the numerous bi and pan people that you probably know yourself. Just like any of the numerous bi and pan people you probably know yourself. People whose sexual identities deserve respect and recognition. As I said at the start of this video, I am not bisexual, but I care about bi people and bi representation because I truly believe we all deserve to be treated like the incredibly wonderful and important humans we are. Humanity is messy and confusing, as is sexuality and gender, and everything else that goes into making us who and what we are. And I want people to remember that we should be celebrating each other, this month and every other month, because we're still here. We're still alive, and as much as the world might hate and revile us for being queer, for being LGBT, for being as different as we are, we have to keep going and supporting each other, because if we don't, then the assholes win. But you know, I can't really tell you what to do. If you're content to be the kind of person that shits on bisexuals and you're happy treating another marginalized group like the enemy, then that is your choice to make. I just hope you know that when the leopards eat your face, you'll have no one to blame but yourself. To everyone else, happy Pride. I love you and I hope you're staying strong, or at the very least, I hope you're able to keep going, knowing that someone is rooting for you. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my Patreons for their support, and oh my god, there was just too much to talk about in this subject. This was literally my longest representation video ever, and I only covered like maybe 2/3 of all the things I had in mind, because there's just always one more thing to talk about. And if I said everything, the video would be 2 hours long and have even less focus than this. So I'm definitely going to have to make a follow-up video at some point. I've just been thinking on this topic since January and it all just started falling out of my head and onto the page, and I'm very tired right now. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope I did the topic justice, and I hope that you're having a good Pride Month. And I am currently dying because I cannot record with the fan on and my room is sweltering. I'm gonna go jump in a lake or something, so I hope you have a lovely day, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.